Hello and welcome back. This is the week 4 lecture. So we continue to move ahead on our historical tour of the movies. And this week we have a big milestone. You probably noticed it just with the choice of film. For this week, we have reached the age of sound. So today we're talking about the advent of sound and the development of sound movies, which of course are quite a bit different than the silent movies that we've been watching up until now. And then we're also talking about the continued rise of Hollywood, the triumph of the studio system. That's the second reading I would like you guys to do from the book this week. We've already talked about Hollywood establishing itself as the major movie-making mecca of the U.S. That's kind of already happened. We've talked about the development of Hollywood into this sort of powerhouse industry during the 20s. And that was really happening while silent movies were reaching their apex, kind of reaching their highest point, which we've already seen. The last 2 weeks, we've watched examples of big, epic, silent films. Now, of course, one comes from Germany, but the other one, The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, was very much a Hollywood film. So we've already seen the development of silent films, and it was quite a rapid development. We started with very primitive, non-narrative films, and then by the 20s, we have these pretty modern, complex, narratively and technically complex movies that are feature length, pretty exciting. They have star actors and actresses. We talked about some of those features, but the one thing, of course, they lacked was in-movie sound. We had musical accompaniment often at the movie theaters where we were watching these films, but no sound actually in the film. And that changes this week. And our first example of a sound film is The Wizard of Oz, which many of you have probably seen before, but it has the distinction of not just being our first sound film. It was not the first sound film, as we'll talk about in a moment. It comes along almost a decade after the real advent of sound, but it's our first sound movie. And it's also our first movie in color. It's the first time we are seeing color, Technicolor, which will become a staple of movies soon afterwards. So we'll talk about both of those developments. Let's start with sound because it obviously is very noteworthy and very different from what we've already seen. So as the book says, the advent of sound brings along this huge surge of creativity, innovation, all kinds of changes. But anytime you have rapid change like that, you're also going to have some instability. And we've kind of mentioned this in passing already, how some directors and even actors and actresses did not always make the transition from silent movies to sound movies, or talkies, as they were sometimes called, because we could finally hear the actors talking. We didn't just have to read the intertitles. Some people just didn't adapt, and there was actually a little bit of concern and alarm at the end of the 1920s when sound comes along. Some scholars of film, some people who thought a lot about film, actually thought it could be a bad thing. We thought that silent movies were maybe better in some ways. At least they were established, they were known. There had been, a development of certain methods and techniques suitable for silent movies, and there was a transition as we moved into sound. Some people didn't want to do sound. Maybe they didn't have great voices if they were performers. Some directors just didn't want to adapt to the new methods, the new technology. Some audience members were skeptical. And some of the early experiments with sound were not exactly great. It took a while for us to kind of perfect the technology. Another thing the book mentions is that we lost some things, not just actors, directors, but think about the musical accompaniment in the old movie palaces of the 1920s. We've talked about this before. You, in some cases, would have had big orchestras if you were in a really big movie house. If you were in a smaller one, maybe in a smaller town, you would have at least had a piano player or an organ player who would have played along with the silent movie. But now they're gone. on. We don't really need the musical accompaniment anymore because we have sound in the movie. We also lose some of the fun live sound effects that would have been provided in the theaters. All of that stuff becomes unnecessary. So we lose some people. It's a little bit of a tough transition for a few years, but it doesn't take long before sound becomes the standard. Sound starts working really well. And of course, silent movies by the end of the 30s really have gone away by and large. I mean, you might still see one every now and again, but really by 1930, as early as 1930, basically all American films were wired for sound. Now, abroad, in some other countries, silent films stuck around for a little bit longer, but by the end of the 30s, basically everybody is doing sound. But the first real experiments with sound were kind of spotty. The book mentions a movie called Don Juan, which comes out in 1926. It did not utilize sound in the modern way, but it is sometimes thought of as one of the early, maybe the first sound film. It had sort of this weird way of doing it, though. It had a musical score that was recorded on discs. This was similar to a system that Edison had created a few years earlier, but there was actually no dialogue in the film, so we don't hear the actors talking. Instead, the score, the music that was composed for the film, was just synchronized to kind of correspond to the images, to what was happening on screen. And they had this kind of clunky setup where they had to kind of link up a sort of phonograph-looking player to the projector. Or that might have been Edison's original system, I don't know, but it was similar to that. It wasn't true sound, it wasn't truly in the movie, it was just synced up with the movie. But that was still a step in the right direction. We don't truly get a talkie, a real sound film, though, until the following year, 1927, when The Jazz Singer debuts. So this is like a trivia question, a historical footnote. What is the first sound movie in the U.S.? Most people would say The Jazz Singer. And again, that's 1927. Just to think about that, almost 100 years ago, we have this huge change, this shift in movies. The Jazz Singer isn't really a great film. That's why I say it's a footnote. It's the answer to a trivia question. Even a lot of people who know about the movie haven't necessarily watched the movie. It doesn't get viewed very much anymore. And part of that is the genre that it belonged to and the fact that the main actor, Al Jolson, the protagonist, spends most of the movie in blackface, as he is portraying an African-American character in a way that we generally find pretty offensive today. But in the 20s, it was still fairly common, and Jolson himself was an old vaudeville performer. I think I've mentioned vaudeville before as kind of an important precursor to modern films. Vaudeville was sort of a leftover from the 19th century. These were sort of like traveling shows that would often, kind of go from city to city, kind of closely aligned with certain kinds of stage performances, but not all vaudeville would be like acting-based performances. There would also be music and sort of like variety shows, if that makes any sense, but a lot of them would feature skits or kind of brief little narrative things played out on stage, often by actors like Jolson, who had a background in singing and dancing. So it was a little bit like musical theater. There were some other elements as well, but a lot of vaudeville, because it had its roots in an older America, a 19th century America, a lot of the stories of the skits that you would see in vaudeville would revolve around black characters, sometimes actually played by black performers, but often played by white performers like Jolson, who were pretending to be black and sort of adopting this very stereotypical sort of set of mannerisms, often singing, dancing, and kind of an exaggerated sort of black person impersonation. Again, we find this rather distasteful today. So it's not a movie that people pop on and sit around to watch anymore, but it is significant largely because it's kind of the first full-blown sound movie. There were lip-sync recordings in the film, a few exchanges of dialogue. It was still largely a silent film. If you do watch clips, you can find clips online. A lot of it still looks and feels very much like a silent film, like the ones we've seen before. There were just a few sound inserts. But like the book says, even though it wasn't great, it proved that sound could work. Again, there was skepticism at first. Some people were like, yeah, we don't know if audiences want sound. They're kind of happy with what we have with silent movies. And remember, like we were saying last week, silent films had really reached this apex, this high water mark by the end of the 20s. Big sweeping epics like Metropolis and The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. These were really popular films, artistically accomplished, narratively complex. So this shift to a different kind of movie, it wasn't automatic. It wasn't something that everybody supported right away. We had to kind of see the proof of concept. We had to see that sound movies could work and could be popular with audiences before the studio heads and producers really bought in fully to this new technology. But again, by the start of the 30s, we were pretty much fully on board with sound movies. But the book points out that there was a little bit of a rocky transition. Hollywood lost a little bit of its influence in the international market because movies were now featuring dialogue. You could hear actors talking, so now language became a little bit more important. I've mentioned in previous weeks that part of how Hollywood became so powerful over the course of the 20s was that they weren't just controlling domestic movie production, they were also exporting a lot of their movies to other countries, to other places where movies were popular, throughout Europe, throughout parts of Asia, Latin America, and that was a big part of how they built this sort of global audience and influenced other national film industries. But a big reason why they were able to do that was because in the 20s, all movies were silent, so language didn't matter. And it was pretty easy to come up with new versions of the intertitles that would be translated to whatever language in whatever country you happen to be sending the movie to. But as one quote from the book says, we in the sound era, movies become prisoners of their own language. So it becomes a little bit more difficult to export a movie that's in English. A movie where everybody is speaking English. Obviously, that's not going to make a lot of sense to a French audience or, a German audience or a Sri Lankan audience. So in years to come, we would perfect dubbing technology, and we would get better at subtitles, and we would get better at sort of doing the translation work necessary to export sound films. But that would take a few years. That wasn't immediate. So in the early 30s, there is a little bit of a drop-off in terms of Hollywood's international market. And they lose a little bit of their footing, but also, of course, the Great Depression had started in the U.S., and that was another factor that kind of slowed down the movie industry, but really just for a few years. It wasn't a long-term setback. Pretty soon, Hollywood was back on top again. But just remember, this is a big change. We lose some of the features of the silent era that we've learned about in previous weeks. But one really interesting thing to note, and the book talks about this, I just wanted to spend another moment on it, is that films now, in the sound era, films become completely autonomous, independent works of art. They are complete packages unto themselves. They don't need any external accompaniment. And this is one of those things that's going to seem obvious to us at first, because this is how we've always imagined movies. This is how we've always thought of movies. Everything you need for the movie is contained within the movie, right? All the visual elements, but also all of the auditory or the aural elements, everything pertaining to sound, what we hear, all of that's in the movie. We don't need anything outside the movie to be there in order for us to understand the movie. But you have to understand that's different. When this shift occurs around 1930, that's a big difference, right, compared to how movies had existed for the first, 30, 20, 25 years of their existence. Previously, you had the silent film up on screen, but then you had these other things that we've talked about. Maybe an orchestra, maybe a piano player, maybe live sound effects. Also, there was a big difference between different exhibitors, different theaters, different places where you might watch the movie. And exhibition really did vary widely. There were different techniques, different methods. Some theaters would even have performers up in the front. You would have different viewing experiences depending on where you were and where you were watching the movie. You might hear different kinds of music. You might have different kinds of simultaneous performance, or at least sound effects that went along with the movie, but those sound effects were unique to that particular theater, that particular place. If you went to a different movie theater in a different city, you would get different music, different sound effects, a different overall experience. And that's how people came to understand movies, largely. But sound movies were different. They were more self-contained. Everything was there in the movie. So that became important to the way films were theorized, thought about, written about, understood, and now we largely view movies as these autonomous artistic packages. You put a movie on and you don't need anything else, right? Everything you need is contained within the movie. But this does take some power away from the exhibitors. The owners of movie theaters no longer played a particularly big role in communicating a film to an audience. And in time, a lot of those exhibitors would get bought out by Hollywood studios, and they just became a part of that larger Hollywood machine. And at the beginning of the 30s, that was sort of a new thing, a little bit of a sad thing, but very soon it just became the standard. So there was new technology, obviously, a lot more emphasis now placed on the microphone, which is kind of the audio equivalent to the camera, right? So the camera is in charge of our visual experience, right? The camera mediates what we see. But now we need microphones, we need sound mixing technology, we need a lot of audio equipment to be able to communicate the sound level of whatever's going on in the movie. So the sound recording process required new professionals. You had new people on set working on the movie. It became a part of editing as well, and it just became a standard part of the viewing experience. But obviously, new microphones had to be invented, new editing techniques had to be pioneered. We had to sort of catch up to the sound revolution, and within a few years, we largely had. A few other changes that they mention, longer shots due to dialogue. So that's something that we might not think about, but remember, silent films like the ones we've seen did not really have to worry about capturing conversations between characters. So, in some ways, that lent itself to a really big scale in scope that we noticed in Metropolis and the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. You could have these really big canvases, big sweeping scenes. And yeah, we had quieter moments where it might have just been a few characters or a couple of characters sitting, talking indoors. But we didn't always linger very long because we didn't have the chance to hear what they were saying anyway. So we might get some intertitles kind of summarizing their conversation, and then we move on. But with the advent of sound, we needed to spend a little bit more time with actors as they sat around or stood around and talked. We needed to be able to hear what they were saying. So the addition of dialogue did result in some new camera techniques, some new methods for shooting and editing movies. So yeah, we got some longer shots in order to capture dialogue, but in order to keep things moving and so that we wouldn't bore audiences, we were incorporating more camera movement within individual shots. So cameras weren't as stationary as they had been oftentimes during the silent era. We talked in the past how even in the silent era, we were starting to move towards more camera movement. We were starting to mount cameras on dollies so we could move them around, track actors as they moved, moved through the frame. So that was already happening in the 20s, but it becomes even more important with sound movies. We have more movement, more reframing, which means we have a change in camera angle without a noticeable cut. Right now we might have to zoom in a little bit closer on an actor as they're speaking. Right? We might need to capture something that they're saying or the intricacies and nuances of a conversation. So we just have more dynamic movement, even though in some cases shots become a little bit longer. We have more panning, more tracking, and often a quicker succession of scenes that would kind of compensate for a slower tempo that we might sometimes get within scenes. So just a few other changes. And also, when it comes to music, there's obviously a major change. It was now squarely in the background of most movies. It was in the background of action. It was in the background, maybe, of dialogue. But also, in some cases, music could function within the fictive universe of a film. So I just want to point out kind of the two ways that music normally gets used in modern sound movies. And you guys can start kind of looking out for these, watching for these, noticing these. The most common type that we typically get would be called non-diegetic music, which just means it's music that's being sort of added to the action of the movie. It's not supposed to be taking place within the world of the movie. So like if we're watching the actor drive down the street, or we see the actors walking into a place and there's music playing, often that music is really just meant to exist for the audience. Like that music was composed or scored by somebody, agreed on by the director. There's a soundtrack. Maybe you can buy it separately. But that music is non-diegetic. It's not supposed to be happening in the action of the movie. It's just for the audience. So in other words, the actors don't hear that song as they walk into the restaurant. That's just for the audience. That's non-diegetic. That's normally how music works. But of course, we also hear music that's supposed to really be happening in the world of the movie. The most obvious example would be if they walk into a club or a restaurant or a bar and there's a band playing, right? So now the audience hears the band playing, but the actors, the characters in the scene, they're also meant to hear it, right? They are there and they're hearing it and responding to it at the same time that audiences are. So that would be diegetic. The diegesis just means like it's the world of the movie. Right? So sometimes we hear music that's really playing in the world of the movie. A lot of times, though, it's non-diegetic. It's just for the audience. It's not really supposed to be happening in the movie. Sometimes also you might hear, as an example of diegetic music, like if they turn on the radio in the movie and then they're listening to the song on the radio, the audience is also listening to it. But just see if you can notice that shift. When is the music diegetic and when is it not? When is it only for the audiences, and when is it also taking place in the movie? Because it's sometimes kind of important in terms of the narrative, or in terms of how the audience or characters or both might be intended to or supposed to feel. How are they feeling? What's happening? Sometimes music is a big cue as far as what's happening in the plot or what emotions are kind of in the air, both for the actors and the audience. So music's always interesting, and I find that we often pay attention to music in movies for various reasons. So it's really now in the 30s that music starts to function in kind of a modern way in sound movies. Also, the advent of sound means increased importance for screenwriting. So we've mentioned screenplays before. The screenplay or the script would usually be written before the movie is shot, before production begins, and the screenplay is sort of the guide. It is the written narrative that they are attempting to capture visually and orally in the movie. So we know what screenplays are typically, and they'd already existed. I've mentioned a few screenwriters already, but with dialogue. Now that we can hear the actors in character talk to one another, screenwriting becomes even more important, and we start importing novelists and playwrights, people who already had experience writing narratives that might later be performed. Now they were being brought in to write screenplays. It mattered how the characters talked. It mattered that the dialogue was good and realistic. So that becomes more important, and screenwriting is a whole sort of separate thing that's like a very important profession. Right now, some screenwriters would also direct their own movies, but a lot of screenwriters just churned out the screenplay. They would get bought by studios or sort of handed out to particular producer teams or directors, and then the movie would be shot. All right, so now that we're getting into a little bit more about the business side, how the movies work, let's shift back to Hollywood and talk about our second reading, The Triumph of the Studio System. So as the book points out, by the late 1930s, the studio system in Hollywood had sort of taken full control of the movie industry domestically and continued to exercise a lot of influence abroad. So by the late 30s, 75% of all U.S. films that were made came from the Hollywood studios. That's a big percentage. And about 90% of all box office revenue was created by Hollywood film production. So these were most of the movies that were getting made, and certainly most of the movies that were making money. And as I mentioned before, some of these big studios that came to dominate are still around. Some of them still exist, of course, in slightly different forms, because there's been a lot of corporate mergers and takeovers and things that we don't really have to worry about. But we probably recognize some of these names, right? Paramount, Fox, Warner Brothers, MGM, and RKO. Those were considered the big five studios. The ones that had the biggest operations, the most power, and they had the vertical integration that we've talked about before, meaning they controlled production, distribution, and exhibition. They would normally own their own theater chains where they would show their movies. So again, listen to those names again. Paramount, Fox, Warner Brothers, MGM, and RKO. I think 4 of the 5 still exist. RKO's gone, but the other 4 still exist in some form today. Those were the big 5. Then there were three, those were called the major studios, the five majors. And then there were three smaller studios that were considered minor studios, but they were kind of important too. Universal, which still exists, Columbia, and United Artists. I'm pretty sure UA still exists in some form as well. Those were smaller studios, but they still churned out really good movies. They had top-rate production, both nationwide and international distribution, just like the big five studios. And that international distribution was big. That meant you could ship your movies overseas. What really differentiated the minors from the majors was that the minors didn't control their own exhibition. They did not own their own theaters, so they didn't possess that vertical integration, making them a little bit less powerful and profitable than the majors. But all 8 of those studios were producing a lot of good movies throughout this time. So the book mentions a few other developments or features that we start to see during the 30s. The development of B movies, a concept that some of you might be familiar with, like cheaper movies that were often shot and made pretty quickly. They were often what we would think of now as genre movies. And what's interesting to observe about B movies is that a lot of the genres that were considered kind of low rent or B, kind of lower quality 100 years ago are now just considered regular, popular genres. So like a lot of crime dramas or like gangster movies would have been considered B movies. They were kind of shot on the cheap, somewhat stereotypical characters, screenplays that were often very similar to other types in that genre, but they were popular with audiences. And they launched the careers of several important actors like James Cagney, Edward G. Robinson, but they would have been considered at the time a little bit lowbrow, I guess would be one way of putting it, like kind of cheap thrills, not super serious, high art kind of movies, but more popular for the masses, and they did well. Also, Westerns. A lot of Westerns during this time would have been considered kind of B movies, shot on the cheap, very much reliant on stereotypical characters and sort of stock situations that had already been played out in earlier editions of that genre, but they were popular with audiences. So B movies came to be, pretty important for all of the studios for various reasons. For one, they were cheap to make. They were popular with audiences, but also remember, we're in the 30s now, so the Great Depression is going on. A lot of people are hurting financially, so even the studios were feeling a little bit of a pinch because of the Depression. So B movies, cheaper production costs, that's a big thing due to the economic hardships of the time. Also, they invented double features during this time. I don't know that we really get so many of these anymore, but for a long time, this was a staple of the movie-going experience. You would go to watch one, sort of main attraction, the feature film, but you would also get something before it. Sometimes a B movie, sometimes maybe an animated feature, but you would get 2 movies, 2 features per program, right? So you would go, for the price of 1 ticket, you could go and watch 2 different films, right? And we said before, there would also be, in many cases, before the feature, the big one, you might get newsreels, or you might get little animated shorts, or little brief comedies that were almost like short films. So that was still pretty common during this time. So it's sort of a bigger event in some ways. You're not just going to watch the movie, like the sort of featured attraction. You're going to get some other stuff, right? You're going to get some other programming oftentimes. And that remained a staple. The double feature, that remained a staple for decades. It's kind of gone away now. But in some cases, certain theaters might still do it. So that stuff starts happening. And also, they mention kind of a change to the production model in Hollywood. We don't have to think about this too much, but it is worth mentioning because the production model that comes into fashion during the 30s is still pretty much what we have today. So they talk about in the book sort of shifting from what was previously called the central producer model, where you would have like one or two studio executives supervising all productions for that studio. That's how things were done in the early days, but as movie production becomes more complex, more technologically advanced, that becomes pretty sort of inefficient. So we move to what's called the unit production model. That's where you have a group of producers that would each supervise like 6 to 8 films a year. Each producer would have their own unit, and that unit would specialize in a particular genre. Right? So you might have 6 producers. One of them specializes in westerns. One specializes in comedies. One does gangster movies. One does sort of futuristic sci-fi. One does sort of, melodrama, drawing room type movies, which were popular at the time. So everybody had their own specialty. Everybody had their own unit, and they would make movies within that domain. And that was just more efficient. The power was more distributed amongst many different producers, but they were all working for the studio. They were all working for the studio boss. And they were all trying to make movies on budget, on time, and they were trying to make movies, of course, that were profitable. So the producer within that unit, they would hire the director, they would hire the screenwriter, they would cast the movie, they would hire all the people who would ultimately work on the movie. But also, the studios had like contract players. They had a lot of directors and performers and cinematographers and, art directors, the people who painted the sets. A lot of them were under contract to a particular studio. So when the studio decided, hey, we're going to make this particular movie, they would have a lot of professionals already on contract who they could bring in to work on the film. And that's largely how a lot of movies still get made. People don't tend to be under contract to the studios in the same way. We'll talk about how that changes. Now, more of these professionals just kind of work for whoever wants to hire them. They're not committed to just one studio, but the basic unit production model still is how a lot of movies, a lot of studio movies, get made. So it was thought of as kind of good for creativity, and we still kind of feel that way. But remember, movies remain market-driven, commercially motivated, and we have that vertical integration that we've talked about before. And it's really that vertical integration, the coordination between production, management, distribution, exhibition, all of that sort of comprises the Hollywood system as it came to be known. And that's really how the book defines it. The management structure, market strategies, how they ran production, how they distributed the movies, and then how they exhibited the movies. It was all coordinated, unified, and that became the Hollywood system that really defined this classical era of Hollywood filmmaking. A lot of film scholars and historians will say the 1930s were a particularly fertile time, kind of a golden age for Hollywood, especially by the late 30s. We've had about 10 years worth of sound movies by that point, and the technology's largely been perfected. By the end of the 30s, we have Technicolor, we have all of these new possibilities, and it's a great time for movies. In particular, 1939 is really pointed to as a real high watermark for Hollywood movies. The Wizard of Oz comes out in that year, and also Gone with the Wind comes out in 39. These are massively popular, massively profitable movies that remain pretty popular even today, remarkably, and several other big films came out in that same year. A few other things that we've mentioned before. Genres continue to be codified. I've mentioned several of them: gangster movies, westerns, comedies, melodramas, sci-fi. Genres that are all still with us. Also, the star system. We have a lot of actors continuing to become celebrities. There's a whole cottage industry that really grows up around movie stars. We have magazines, certain publications devoted to them. We have fan clubs. They have huge management teams in charge of kind of managing their public image and arranging, publicity tours and press junkets, all the stuff that we still see today. When actors are out promoting a movie, they're walking the red carpet at some award show, all of that becomes standard during this time. And this combination of genre and stars starts to define individual studios in some cases. And the book talks about how some studios would kind of develop what would be known as their house style. Like certain studios would specialize in certain types of movies. So they use Warner Brothers as sort of an example, right? That particular studio came to be known largely for their crime dramas, their gangster movies starring James Cagney, Edward G. Robinson, that were often very, very popular and very influential to a later generation of gangster movies. If you ever watched the original Scarface, which I think comes out in maybe 31, it's an early talkie. So Warner's gets really known for those types of movies, also musicals, swashbuckling epics, starring Errol Flynn, who was sort of like an early action hero. He specialized in like pirate movies. He'd be like swinging around, on ropes and fighting guys. But also, Warner's was known for their so-called women's pictures. And these were kind of melodramas, drawing room dramas, many of them starring Bette Davis, who you might know, very famous actress of that time. So Warner's got associated with certain genres and certain stars. And that was true of other studios as well. But, so this is a great time, right? Very fertile, innovative time. Great movies are coming out. But, as is so often the case, during this high water mark, the seeds of future destruction have been planted. Or maybe not destruction, but just future problems. Those seeds have already been planted, much like in the golden age of silent films. Near the end of the 20s, everything's going great, but little did some know that we were about to have this huge shift, this huge transition to sound, and just as quickly as silent movies came to prominence, they would kind of go away. Now, it's not the same thing here, but in this golden age, by 39, it's like, okay, nothing can stop Hollywood. This is only going to get bigger and better. But actually, two things happen by the end of the 30s that kind of are going to ultimately be a little bit of a problem or slow things down in the future. The first is the coming of World War II. We haven't quite gotten there yet, but by the early 40s, of course, the U.S. is at war, so that would be a factor. And also, the U.S. government starts to get interested in maybe filing some antitrust motions against the studios. We won't get too deeply into that. We'll talk about it in the weeks to come as it actually happens. But basically, the government becomes convinced that the studios are a huge monopoly. and that they are dominating the movie industry in kind of an illegal way, and they're preventing competition, which is supposed to be, of course, an important part of our capitalist system. So in time, the government would move on the studios and basically say, you guys are a monopoly, you can't do some of this stuff. Largely the vertical integration stuff. You can't control everything. That's kind of antithetical to how we want to do things. It would take decades for the antitrust campaign to really pay off, but it's in its infancy at this point. It's starting to gain some momentum. And another thing that happens in the 30s is the real standardization of a ratings system. And you might think, well, there's always been ratings, but really before the 30s, we didn't have a standard central system for rating movies. You know, now we have rated R, PG-13, PG, G, all the way up to NC-17, I think. You don't see that one as much anymore. But that doesn't really become the norm until the 30s. You have the creation of the MPPDA. That's the Motion Picture Producers and Distribution Association. And that becomes a pretty powerful group. They ultimately implement the PCA, which is the Production Code Administration. And the Production Code would become pretty important as it got more powerful. By 1934, all scripts or screenplays submitted to Hollywood studios had to be approved by the Production Code. So if there was any kind of racy content, anything that the people running the PCA didn't approve of, and that was a lot of depictions of sexuality, certain kinds of violence, certain kinds of language, even certain kinds of identities or certain kinds of people were kind of prohibited, and you couldn't have that stuff in your movie. Previously, it's kind of surprising, it was pretty permissive as far as what you could get away with. Some movies had very kind of risque content, and that was just sort of accepted. But by the 30s, that changes, and we have the really strict rating system. It would get loosened up in the decades to come, although we still have it. And that rating system could sometimes stifle creativity by making people cut stuff out of the screenplay, sometimes homogenizing movies a little bit, taking away some of the diversity of perspective that we normally think of as a good thing with movies. So that's happening too. And that really becomes the standard by the mid-30s, this new rating system. All right, so let's move on to our film for the week, The Wizard of Oz. Much like Metropolis, it's a movie that even if you haven't sat down and watched the film, you've seen some of the iconography, you've seen some of the visuals from this film, because a lot of that stuff lives on in our popular culture. But unlike a lot of the old movies that we've seen so far, a lot of people still watch The Wizard of Oz. It still airs on television. I can remember watching it with my parents as a kid. It's one of the few movies from this era that kind of survives in terms of like being still in our consciousness. Us still kind of being aware of it as an artistic achievement. I think it also sort of resonates with us because there's been a lot of other kind of versions of The Wizard of Oz, like Wicked comes to mind, The Wiz, which was another musical adaptation from like the 70s. So this is a piece of pop culture that's been reimagined, revised, redone, for different audiences in different mediums at different times. So by now, we're all pretty familiar with the basic narrative, and we're kind of familiar with the movie, this movie, even if we've never seen it until now. So the movie is based on a book, L. Frank Baum's 1900 book entitled The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, which sold over 1 million copies and spawned a series of movies. A lot of people don't know the full history of the novel being adapted for the movies. This 39 version is not the first one. It had previously been dramatized on stage, like in a play, and also it had been brought to the big screen by Baum himself. So in 1913, Baum founded his own film company, his own little studio in Hollywood, and he made 3 different movies based on his book. He called them the Land of Oz features, and they all flopped. None of them were successful. None of them were very good films. A different production company did a silent version of The Wizard of Oz in 1925. That also flopped, was not very successful. Then in the 30s, Samuel Goldwyn, a big studio head, ends up buying the film for about $40,000. That's sort of quaint. Goldwyn was part of, I believe, MGM. He gets the film rights, and they want to make the movie, but it takes a while to get the production off the ground. And again, they weren't quite sure that they could pull it off. Again, a fantasy epic like this at the time was still viewed by some as kind of a difficult thing to capture in a movie, right? They needed to see some other examples of similar type movies working before they were going to be willing to invest in this one. And a big breakthrough comes in 1937. When Walt Disney releases their first feature-length cartoon, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. It was very successful. So once that happens, so Goldwyn sells the rights to MGM, to Louis B. Mayer, one of the top guys at the MGM studio, and they end up producing the movie, and they get moving around 1938, and they decide to use Technicolor, which was a new technology at the time. Now, this was not the first color film. We had a couple of really primitive Technicolor sequences in movies as early as the 20s. But most producers initially were sort of reluctant to go forward with color for some of the same reasons that they were reluctant to move forward with sound. They weren't sure if audiences were going to like it. It was a big shift from how movies had previously been. So there was some reluctance. There were some questions. And there's a funny anecdote that some early test audiences who were shown color films or just color sequences in a film would sometimes complain that the color gave them a headache. They didn't like it. Some people made the same complaint about talkies roughly a decade earlier. They didn't like all the noise, gave them a headache, it was sort of weird. But by 38, Technicolor had sort of advanced, and you had over 20 different Technicolor films released that year. And it became a real selling point. It was still kind of a novelty. Producers, studios could sort of sell a movie largely by saying, look, it's in color. And you had some successful color films at the end of the 30s. There was a Robin Hood movie, The Adventures of Robin Hood, that I think comes out in 38. That does pretty well. So by this point, it's doable. So The Wizard of Oz enters production. The cast is somewhat well known today. Judy Garland, at least, would go on to be a big star. She plays Dorothy. A lot of the other actors were song and dance men from Broadway or the old vaudeville tradition. So Ray Bolger, who plays the Scarecrow, Buddy Ebsen plays the Tin Man. He is replaced during shooting of the movie. He got sick due to, I think, some of the costume that he had to wear. His Tin Man get up had some kind of chemical or fume that made him ill. I think. So he was replaced by Jack Haley, who I think appears in the film. And that just kind of sets a trend or a theme that we'll notice if we read about the production of this movie. A lot of people got hurt. It was a very ambitious shoot. So there were a lot of injuries and a lot of sort of unfortunate results of the special effects that they were trying to orchestrate and the costuming. So it's not just the Tin Man who got sick. Margaret Hamilton, who plays the Wicked Witch of the West, was injured by faulty pyrotechnics during the shoot. So there were a lot of accidents and things that probably wouldn't happen now. But a lot of the technology, a lot of the stuff that they were doing back then, still a little bit dangerous, frankly, in the late 30s. But we remember some of these performers. Bert Lahr plays the Cowardly Lion. Nobody remembers him anymore as an actor, but he was quite famous back then. Again, known for his stage performances. He was in vaudeville shows, and he made the transition into movies. So all of these guys sort of had a background in singing, dancing, and acting, but mostly on stage. A lot of them were just sort of starting to transition to movies at this time. So you can read up more about the production. I just find a lot of these facts a little bit interesting. Again, this was a very ambitious shoot. They had huge sets, and that made the principal photography, the actual shooting of the movie, rather difficult. And at times dangerous. So they had these new cameras that they had to use in order to implement the Technicolor technology. So they had as many as 8 different cameras, about a third of Technicolor's full inventory. At the time, Technicolor was sort of its own entity, like its own kind of company that would later be absorbed. So they were producing this technology and the studios were using it. So you had a lot of different cameras that you had to set up in order to get all the tight shots that you wanted. Typically, the main camera would be mounted on a crane or a dolly to keep it moving so it could follow subjects as they moved in the frame. So we might notice that as we're watching. A few just names that you might want to know. Hal Rawson was the director of photography, or the cinematographer would often, those are kind of not exactly the same, but we use those terms kind of interchangeably. But he also had a separate cinematographer in charge of the Technicolor cinematography. So those guys were important for this particular movie. And the overall director is Victor Fleming, who replaced the original director, George Cukor, who was, I think, brought on initially, but then they bring in Fleming to do the bulk of the movie. But the early shots, the early scenes in black and white on the Kansas farm were directed by King Vidor, who was an important silent film director who did not make the transition to sound or color. But he was responsible for those early scenes before we go to Oz. Those black and white scenes. And they were photographed or printed using MGM's sepia platinum process, which went away not too long after that. But that's why those early images have that distinctive sepia tone. But we also had a lot of special effects on this particular film. So you had different effects units operating within the larger art department. So you had one group led by this guy, Arnold Gillespie. They were in charge of miniatures, projection, and mechanical effects. And then you had a separate team led by Warren Newcomb, they were in charge more of what was called the matte painting section. And they were largely in charge of painting sets that would appear in the background of a lot of shots. We don't get a lot of this anymore because we have, computer effects and we have green screens and all of these different things. But back then, you would have a lot of matte painting, which meant just painted sets that were created to sort of, make the illusion that something that wasn't really on screen was. So Newcomb had a very important role, and his sort of painting crew, they had a very important role to fill on this particular movie. So Newcomb was a commercial artist who got his start in the movies in the 20s. And he started a long career working for MGM, one of these big studios. And he's best remembered for some of these shots that are sometimes referred to as beauty shots in Oz. So, for example, a famous shot of Dorothy and her friends walking sort of along the path, walking along the yellow brick road, and you see all of these buildings of the Emerald City sort of looming in the distance. That particular set was just an ornate, elaborate painting done by Newcomb and his team. So in those scenes, the live action was photographed or, shot on a particular section of the road, and then they would have this sort of blacked out or masked out area where the painting would later sort of be inserted, right? So you had the set, and then you had the live action taking place in front of that painted set. Another example is an establishing shot of the witch's castle. That's a complete painting. It's about 40 inches wide, and in that particular shot, we don't actually have any live action. We just get the painting, and it's made to seem real. It's part of the illusion. It's part of what allows us to suspend that sense of disbelief, like I was talking about last week. They did a lot of other cool stuff to create special effects. Again, these are like practical special effects. They didn't have computers. They couldn't go back and add this stuff in later during post-production. So a lot of this stuff had to be created on set, and they had to do this stuff really, in actuality, with the actors. An example would be like the flying monkeys or the tornado scene back in Kansas. So they had this really detailed miniature of the Kansas farm that was, built and created and would sometimes stand in for the real thing. They would shoot it in such a way that it seemed life-size, but it was really a miniature that they had created specifically for that purpose. So it included cornfields, the house, the barn, fences, and to create that tornado scene, they had the miniature, and then they had this huge windsock. You guys have probably seen windsocks before. They're used to measure wind speed. And they're basically kind of what they sound like. They're just kind of big floppy things that are usually attached to a pole or a tower, and they just blow around. I don't really know how the science with those works, but you've seen them before. So they had this huge windsock cast in rubber, and they attached it to a steel gantry that was suspended from the roof. So they're indoors, right? They're inside a studio lot or set, right? So they're inside, they have the miniature, and they have this rig mounted to the ceiling, and they're able to connect the windsock to the rig on the ceiling. A gantry is what they called it. And also on the gantry, they had a little motorized car, not like a car that we would drive, but just a little thing that they could move around, and it was remote controlled. So they attached the windsock to those little cars on the rig on the ceiling, and then by remote control, they could move the car, and by doing so, they could move the windsock. And the windsock is supposed to be the tornado funnel, right? And they could move it in such a way that would make it seem like it was an erratic tornado destroying everything around it. So just kind of cool to think about how they did that. Really innovative, creative. Nowadays it might seem kind of primitive. We have better methods. But considering this was almost 100 years ago, the effects look pretty good. I mean, they did a nice job with all of that stuff. So they also used that same gantry or rig attached to the ceiling of their like indoor set for the flying monkeys. So the flying monkeys were literally suspended from that rig using piano wire. And as you might imagine, that was highly dangerous. Some of the monkeys fell and got hurt. They also had their wings were powered by little hidden motors that you can't see, but they're in there. So that looks pretty good, but again, highly dangerous. There were safety nets and pads, but several monkeys landed very hard, fell from their suspended station, fell, got hurt, had to go to the hospital in some cases. So a lot of those flying monkeys were real actors who were really suspended from the ceiling. But in other cases, they would make models of various scales. Again, that was the miniature department's sort of responsibility. In some cases, they would be as small as 6 inches. And they would also be, flying on wires, often suspended from that rig. And they would be used in the background. They were used in some of the miniature landscapes. So they had a whole team of really talented artists, sculptors, technicians that were making all of this stuff, like literally making it, rigging it up, and using these things to create practical special effects. They had sculptors creating some of the costumes, some of the casts involving aluminum or rubber. It was quite elaborate. And again, sometimes it led to the actors getting hurt. Not all the technology was perfected, but it created a very unique, distinctive visual look and feel that was part of what made the movie so popular. Gillespie, the guy in charge of the miniatures and a lot of the mechanical effects, he was also called in to do the principal photography on a particular scene in the poison poppy field. And this is an early example of a really cool dolly shot. Not the first, there had been dolly shots before, but they had to kind of rig a new kind of dolly. And he had to move over the ground that was, supposedly surrounded by flowers. So he made these special tracks using like some kind of tubing, and he designed a special dolly with runners on it that would fit over the track. And then they could move freely, smoothly, and quietly over these well-lubricated tracks and create movement, follow the actors as they moved. And a lot of this stuff is pretty standard camera work nowadays, but it was quite noteworthy back then. So try to pay attention to some of these special effects. I've only mentioned a few. There's several others. So try to pick out particular scenes that seem to have really cool, interesting special effects and see if you can learn a little bit more about how they created those effects, if you're interested. So principal photography wrapped up in March of 1939. It took them about 5 months to shoot. Pretty long shoot for those days. Cost them about $3 million to make the movie. That does not seem like a lot today, but back then it was a lot. And it was, of course, highly successful on its theatrical run. And it's one of these movies that remains popular today. There's lots of reasons why. I think the story resonates. We like the characters. We like the message. But a lot of the movie's popularity has to do with sound, color, and some of these camera techniques and special effects that create that unique visual style. So look into those things a little bit more as we talk about the film this week. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you next week.